class in the Science, Faith, and Evidence for God. And so I'm not going to mention their name, but last week, if you remember, I asked for a recommendation for a psychiatrist because I was waking up screaming, "Hark the sound of the cannon." And so I just want to thank that person. They referred me to someone, and that psychiatrist has really helped. I didn't know, but lobotomy operations actually work. So,
They did.
And we do them right here.
all right. A couple things. There was a gentleman last week, I'm not sure he's here, asked me about oxygen, and there's a theory that increased oxygen helped the Cambrian explosion was the result of that, and I had some articles I was going to give him, but I guess he's not here. But anyway, here looks like comes a couple other people. Anyway, did y'all see the email that I sent out? We've got a special speaker coming,
Yes.
February 16th. So you'll have a real pro, not a layman. She has her doctorate degree in,
Wow.
in apologetics, and she has come in. She is focused on her PhD thesis was on, she interviewed 50 atheists and why they became Christians. And so she's going to be talking about that, and she has a podcast now called Skeptics, where there's a lot of interviews she's done with atheists and what led them to become Christians. So I think it'll be real interesting and informative, and so please ask your friends, because David said if we get more then we'll fit in here, we'll go to the sanctuary, and I'd really like, because you know, she is sort of a famous person, I guess, I'd like to have a good crowd for her, so if you can be sure to talk that up. Okay, first session was on the Big Bang, if y'all remember. The second was on the Cambrian explosion, or the fossil record, how it did not support evolution. Well, today we're going to talk about another major problem with the evolutionary theory other than the fossil record. So does anyone know what junk DNA is? Anybody ever heard that term? Okay. Junk DNA is also known as non-functional DNA. It's a DNA sequence that doesn't have a known biological function. So basically, in the human genome, the DNA, there are projections up to as high as 98% of the DNA doesn't do anything. It's just junk, and it's kind of left over from the evolutionary process. So the term junk DNA started back in the 1970s, and for decades the scientific consensus was that junk DNA represented around 50 to 98% of the human genome. So basically most of your DNA was considered useless. It had no function. And the reason for junk DNA was the evolutionary process with its mechanism of saving the useful mutations that give it a better ability to survive. It would keep those, and it would discard the mutations that didn't provide a survival advantage. So over millions of years, these discarded mutations that had no function would just accumulate in the human genome. So we're going to go immediately into a short video that will give more background on junk DNA and what scientists have thought for decades about it.
Okay. You know how you can tell a lot about a doctor with dead office plants? You can also tell a lot about a scientific theory by the predictions it makes. Here's the story. In 1972, this handsome fellow made a prediction that at least 90% of DNA appears to represent nonsense, and he coined the term junk DNA. Fast forwarding a bit, in 1980, Nature published papers by influential biologists arguing that evolution predicts our DNA should be full of junk. They predicted junk DNA would be everywhere and that it's folly to hunt for any function in these areas of DNA. Because of natural selection, we should expect to find our bodies riddled with heaps of useless junk DNA. In the early 2000s, the Human Genome Project was finished, and we found out that only about 1 to 2% of our DNA builds the proteins we need to live. What in the world was the other 98% doing? It was immediately assumed that it was largely junk. This follows a long tradition of evolutionists preferring to view our bodies as poorly cobbled together assemblies of ill-fitted parts held together with not much more than spit and duct tape. You might feel that way the older you get, but that's not because of junk in your DNA. Look at your posture. Eat a vegetable every once in a while for crying out loud. This textbook taught many biology students that over half of the genome is composed of parasite-like segments of DNA and take up large amounts of space. Famed evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins said in 1976, "The true purpose of DNA is to survive, no more and no less. The simplest way to explain the surplus DNA is to suppose that it's a parasite." And in 2004, creationists might spend some earnest time speculating on why the creator should bother to litter genomes with untranslated pseudogenes and junk tandem repeat DNA. In 2009, the greater part, 95% in the case of humans, of the genome might as well not be there for all the difference it made.
Okay, y'all remember our favorite guy, Richard Dawkins, the atheist and famous biologist? This quote, I feel like he's just sticking the knife into Christians and turning it, and he's being very sarcastic here. He's saying creationists might spend some earnest time speculating on why the Creator should bother to litter genomes with untranslated pseudogenes and junk tandem repeat DNA. So he's basically saying, why would a God that's all perfect produce the DNA molecule and it just be full of junk? Everyone understand that? Which is a good question, right? I mean, and he says that probably the greater part, 95% of the human genome is useless. It's just junk. So by this, he's saying this supports evolution. It doesn't support creationism. Does everyone understand that?
Makes. And Dawkins isn't alone. Prominent evolutionists, from the head of the Faraday Institute to the director of the National Institutes of Health and many tenured professors, all predicted junk.
Okay. How many have heard of Francis Collins? Anybody heard of Francis Collins? He was head of the Human Genome Project that basically cataloged the human genome and came out, and it was an international project of scientists all over the world. And he's actually a Christian, but he believes that God used evolution to produce everything that we see in life today. He even said 45% of the human genome is made up of flotsam and jetsam. And the function, here at University of Houston, the functional fraction within the human genome cannot exceed 15%, meaning 85% is junk.
It's interesting, who are they basing that on? How do they even know that? I mean, that way, they've got nothing, they've got no historical data to prove anything that they're saying.
Well,
We don't know that.
well, you got a great point, and we're going to see that that's fallen apart in the last 10 or 15 years.
And remember, you can tell a lot about a theory from the predictions that it makes. Scientists that supported intelligent design, though, had different predictions about junk DNA. Ever since the beginning days of the ID movement in the 1990s, ID proponents had predicted that...
Okay, y'all remember we talked a little bit about intelligent design. Does everyone know kind of what intelligent design is? It's a movement of scientists that think that there is strong evidence that there is an intelligence behind the universe and everything we see. Now, they try to do it from a scientific viewpoint. They never say, well, it's God of the Bible or anything. They just look at the evidence and say, on this discovery, it really points to an intelligence behind it. So that's what this movement, intelligent design, means.
That the junk DNA would turn out to be largely functional. What would cause these scientists to go against the tide of decades of established scientific thought? Why does ID predict function for junk DNA? It's simple. Because intelligent agents make things with purpose and function. They have reasons for why they do things. Perhaps the earliest ID prediction of a function for junk DNA came in 1994, when pro-ID scientist Forrest Mims submitted a letter to Science, warning against assuming that junk DNA was useless. Science would not publish the letter. In 1998, William Dembski predicted function for junk DNA, arguing that even the term junk DNA discouraged scientific inquiry, a label that cloaked scientific ignorance with a veneer of confidence. He says, on an evolutionary view, we expect a lot of useless DNA. If, on the other hand, organisms are designed, we expect DNA, as much as possible, to exhibit function. Design encourages scientists to look for function where evolution discourages it.
So is everyone following that? That, you know, evolution basically assumes there's going to be junk there, whereas creation or intelligent design thinks that this intelligence would not have created junk. It would everything would have a purpose. Okay.
In 2002, biologist Richard Sternberg published a peer-reviewed paper in the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences, stating the selfish DNA narrative and allied frameworks must join the other icons of neo-Darwinian evolutionary theory that, despite their variance with empirical evidence, nevertheless persist in the literature. In other words, the idea of junk DNA was like an idol in the scientific community. Empty, but nevertheless handed down due to tradition rather than evidence. In 2004, biologist Jonathan Wells argued, the fact that junk DNA is not junk has emerged. Not because of evolutionary theory, but in spite of it. On the other hand, people asking research questions in an ID framework would presumably have been looking for the functions of non-coding regions of DNA all along, and we might know considerably more about them. In 2011, Wells wrote The Myth of Junk DNA, citing hundreds of peer-reviewed papers finding function for junk DNA. In 2012, a game-changing paper was published in Nature from ENCODE, a consortium of hundreds of researchers from all around the world. It found that 80% of DNA shows evidence of functional biochemical activity. Well, so that means 20% is still junk, right? Well, no. Lead ENCODE researcher Ewan Burney noted that they only studied a portion of human cells, and with continued research, it's likely that 80% will go to 100%. The implications were immediately clear. Science magazine ran a headline stating, ENCODE writes eulogy for junk DNA, and stated that the ENCODE papers sound the death knell for the idea that our DNA is mostly littered with useless bases. Apart from a zealous faction of hardline evolutionists, the consensus of biologists now recognizes that junk DNA isn't junk, but has important functions. In other words, junk DNA was an evolutionary myth. More recent papers confirm this. This 2021 paper declares the days of junk DNA are over. This article in Nature 2021 finds over 130,000 specific functions identified for genomic elements previously called junk DNA. This article says the genome is far from what was once called islands of genes among intergenic deserts. James Shapiro, University of Chicago. The concept of abundant, selfish, or junk DNA in complex genomes is mistaken. This 2023 paper in Bioessays declared a paradigm shift away from the concept of junk DNA. DNA that was previously thought to be junk turns out to have many functions, including
forming telomeres, centromeres, and higher order nuclear structures, binding cohesin to chromosomes, nucleation centers for DNA methylation, chromatin condensation, cellular stress responses, cell differentiation, DNA repair, controlling development and forming body plans, controlling the cell cycle, forming fear-related memories and phobia, immune-related functions like fighting virus infections, metabolism-related.
Did everyone get that? There's a pop quiz at the end of it, you've got to know these.
And the biggest and most important function for junk DNA is that it regulates gene expression. To understand the importance of what this means, consider building a house. Proteins would be like the wood, the bricks, the nails, the concrete. But if you want a house, it's not enough to just have those things laying in a pile. You need to know how to assemble it all. In other words, you need a blueprint. Instructions to tell you how to build a house are just as vital as the physical materials themselves. This is what the non-coding regions of DNA, what we used to call junk DNA, does in your body. It contains the blueprints and tells your body when and where to produce different types of proteins, how much to produce, where to put them, and when to stop making them. In other words, evolutionary biologists for a long time, and many still to this day, discount some of the most important genetic information in your entire body. The story of junk DNA shows that scientists who support intelligent design not only made a prediction that turned out to be true and helped progress science forward, but also evolutionary theory hindered science by discouraging inquiry for years in this very important part of our genome. After ENCODE, most biologists today recognize that junk DNA is highly functional. So how did evolutionists react? There were some intellectual objections to the evidence, but mostly they got angry. They tried to rewrite history, or they tried to deny the data to salvage their beloved theory. But more on that in the next video. Thanks for watching. If you like this kind of science content, please make sure.
Okay. Let's see. Get this over here. Okay. They talk a lot about the ENCODE project. Anybody want to make a guess of what that ENCODE stands for? It stands for the Encyclopedia of DNA Elements, ENCODE. Consortium was started in 2003 and is an ongoing international collaboration of research groups funded by the National Human Genome Research Institute. The goal of ENCODE is to build a comprehensive parts list of functional elements in the human genome, including elements that act at the protein and RNA levels, and regulatory elements that control cells and circumstances in which a gene is active. Basically, after the human genome was cataloged a couple of years earlier, 2003, they want to know, well, let's look inside the DNA and what does it actually do? So this started, and this is the group that came out in I think it was 2012 was their first paper showing that what had been thought of and was consensus in the scientific arena was that it was junk. They started finding all of these functions that this junk DNA is doing. So anyway, it's a big group of a lot of scientists actually around the world.
Do you think that research contributed to the COVID vaccine? Because the COVID vaccine was focused on changing the body's RNA so it would react differently to the virus.
Okay.
So that research probably led into that.
It may have.
And what they found is not everybody is the same.
Right.
We're like snowflakes. Not all our RNA and all that DNA is the same. So that's why so many people afterwards had problems. Probably. I'm just asking a question.
Yeah, that sounds reasonable to me, but I'm not a scientist. Okay, I thought we'd take a little break because we're going to watch another little thing. And my good friend Ted Day over here is an attorney, and he's very sharp. But some of his colleagues are not the sharpest tools in the toolbox. Here is actual happenings in court. Here's an attorney. Attorney, what is the date of your birth? Witness, July 18th. Attorney, what year? Witness, every year. Next, attorney. Now, doctor, isn't it true that when a person dies in his sleep, he doesn't know about it until the next morning? The doctor responds, did you actually pass the bar exam? And again, these are actual happenings. You can't make this up. Okay, here's attorney. Doctor, before you performed the autopsy, did you check for a pulse? Witness, no. Attorney, did you check for blood pressure? Doctor, no. Attorney, did you check for breathing? Witness, no. Attorney, so then is it possible that the patient was alive when you began the autopsy? And the witness, the doctor says no. And the attorney says, well, how can you be so sure, doctor? Doctor, because his brain was sitting on my desk in a jar. And the attorney says, but could the patient have still been alive nevertheless? And the doctor says, yes, it's possible that he could have still be alive and practicing law. You worked with some of these guys, didn't you? Okay, here's another, the second video, and we're just going to watch a portion of this because it sort of gets into very detailed scientific things that are basically a little over my head, maybe a lot over my head.
Species are important, but it's the differences that make the difference. By assuming that much of the DNA that's different between species was junk, evolutionists missed out on crucial scientific. Evolutionists like to talk about how intelligent design is anti-science. Ken Miller, Brown University, once said that intelligent design is a science stopper. Kevin Padian, University of California, Berkeley, said that it makes people stupid. In other words, they believe that intelligent design is something like this. It's a science stopper. But in the last video, we saw how, in the case of junk DNA, it was actually evolution that was stopping science and discouraging research. Intelligent design, on the other hand, not only encouraged research, but made predictions that turned out to be correct. You remember when leading scientific journals said that ENCODE sounded the, quote, death knell for junk DNA? ENCODE scientists didn't come at their work with an agenda against evolution. They just wanted to understand what was going on in the cell. Everyone recognized the powerful evidence that ENCODE provided. So how did evolutionists react? Some had legitimate questions. Some tried to rewrite history. Others got angry and tried to deny the data to salvage their beloved theory. They still, to this day, claim it's junk, even in light of all the evidence from ENCODE and elsewhere showing that junk DNA has function. Let's take a look. Many people have not been happy about ENCODE's findings. Developmental biologist P.Z. Myers claimed the ENCODE researchers are fundamentally dishonest and that they didn't have a clue about biology. Bioinformatician Nick Madsky claimed that ENCODE researchers lacked broad training in basic comparative biology, in other words, evolution. Biochemist Lawrence Moran flatly called the ENCODE scientists stupid. Dan Grauer made a presentation that said he wanted to kill ENCODE, complete with bullet holes and blood. Talk about angry. Even leading journals like Science and Nature recognize the anger, rudeness, intemperate griping, and vitriolic hyperbole levied by ENCODE's critics.
So, as you see, there are still some scientists out there that are still so stuck on evolution that they discount what's all of these other scientists have found about DNA, and it's actually, there isn't a lot, or so far, they keep finding more and more functions in the DNA as they continue this project. So they referred to, if you remember, this Science magazine article, which is a prestigious science magazine. It talked about Dan Glorer of the University of Houston, who was one of the guys pictured there that, you know, he said he'd like to kill the ENCODE project. Instead of saying, well, let's look at the evidence, well, he wants to kill it. And then, so Science wrote an article about him, and they called him the Vigilante. And here's some quotes. Some of y'all probably can't read this, but this article in Science about this professor at the University of Houston and what was his motivation to be so angry about what the ENCODE project was finding. It says, Grower's atheism inflamed his anger at ENCODE. Now this is in a science magazine. They hardly ever get into religion, but why? It points out that he's so mad because he is a very vocal and staunch atheist.
Makes sense. Yeah.
And he perceived, the article goes on to say, he perceives an echo of intelligent design in the consortium's 80% claim of usefulness, which he takes to imply that most of the genome exists because it serves a purpose. So he hates this claim, or the evidence that ENCODE is found that these parts of the DNA that for decades were thought as junk, it has a purpose, because if it has a purpose, who made it have a purpose? So, and he also says, as a result, species like humans and elephants that have a small effective population size are expected to accumulate a lot of junk in their DNAs. Okay, one of the scientists on ENCODE said, well, Grower and other critics place undue emphasis on the 80%, says John, I don't know how you pronounce his last name, an ENCODE principal investigator at the University of Washington, Seattle. The real take-home lesson, he says, is there is a tremendous amount of activity encoded in the genome, much more than researchers had suspected. So he really gives him a very gentle rebuttal. He says, well, don't look at the percentage. This is the evidence. We found functionality in all of these parts of the DNA. So let me go back up. Remember when we talked about what the ENCODE consortium was? Now, if you'll remember some of the remarks that Professor Dan made, as well as, here's one from P.Z. Meyer, if you remember back, he claimed that ENCODE scientists were fundamentally dishonest, and they didn't have a clue about biology. Here's Nick Matsey, a scientist, said the ENCODE researchers lack broad training in basic comparative biology. And Lawrence Moran, biochemist, called the ENCODE scientists stupid. And then Dan Grower, if you remember, said he had wanted to kill ENCODE. Well, I went out, I got this off of ENCODE's website, I believe. And this is the universities today, and I assume probably they were in the original back when this, all this criticism happened against ENCODE. But look where the scientists are coming from that are on the ENCODE project that these people call stupid and don't know anything about biology. University of California, San Francisco, Stanford University, University of Washington, Cornell University, Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, Duke University, Harvard, MIT, University of Chicago, University of Michigan. I mean, these are some of Johns Hopkins University. These are scientists working at some of the most prestigious institutes in our nation. And here these guys are calling them stupid. I don't think so. So a lot of this, if you'll notice, this article on Dan Grohr and was in March 2014. Again, all of this criticism came out after this major paper that ENCODE first published. I think it was in 2012 maybe. So anyway, since this 2014 Science article about all the criticism that the scientific community has gotten, or that work on the ENCODE project, has the scientific evidence gone toward Professor Brewer's junk DNA position? Well, no. More and more scientific, as we have seen from these videos, more and more scientific evidence of the last 10 years has confirmed greater and greater portions of the human genome are functional and not junk. Oh, there was one thing I forgot to do. I wanted to show you a clip toward the end of this.
Evolutionists like to talk about how intelligent design is anti-science. Kim Miller, Brown University, once said that because that's the amount of DNA that's similar between humans and other mammals. But do you see the problem? If only the common bits of DNA are functional, why would a mouse be a mouse and not you? So some of this junk DNA does DNA control the unique things about an organism?
Well, I don't think I'm going to be able to show it, but that professor, Dan Brewer at the University of Houston, he did a presentation about 2013 at a conference on junk DNA, and he basically said, well, if junk DNA is not true, then evolution is not true. He made that, and so this was in 2013. He basically said that. I mean, he sold the whole farm on this, that it was junk DNA was throughout the human genome. So that his quote in that presentation is not aged very well based on the scientific
Species are
discoveries.
important, but it's the differences that...
Okay, sorry about my technical difficulties. Okay.
Blame it on your junk DNA.
You know where some scientists had thought that the junk DNA was up to 98%. My wife, when I was telling her about it, she said, well, I think it's 99.9%. I've lived with you for 40 years, so she has even a different take on it. Okay, another, I called it Junk DNA Strikes Out Again. Guess what? One of the Nobel Prizes in 2024 was awarded to two scientists who discovered, they actually made this discovery in 1993, how gene activity is regulated. And that comes from what was originally considered junk DNA. They actually got the Nobel Prize. Here's one of the scientists at the New York Genome Center said, he tweeted, Nobel for not junk DNA, microRNA, which is what it was talking about. And this is from the National Cancer Institute. This scientist says, there are a lot of important things in what was called junk DNA not too long ago. And then, this is a distinguished scientist from India. Now, it was interesting, when they came out with this discovery in 1993, I read an article about it, and it said the scientific community met this discovery with a deafening silence. Why? Because it countered what they had been thinking about DNA for so long. But he says The reason it didn't garner more scientific recognition was the textbook level strong belief that anything not coding for a protein is selfish or junk DNA. So again, here we are in 2025, and in just last year, 2 scientists are awarded the Nobel Prize for finding a use for a particular part of the human genome. Okay, I have a question for y'all. Why do scientists keep getting major science so wrong? Okay?
Because they enter it with what they believe. And I would venture to say 90+% of them are atheists, so their science is dedicated to proving them right.
I'm not sure it's quite 90% from what I read, but the vocal ones are usually atheists, like that professor from Houston. But if you remember in our first session, we looked at the Big Bang. Remember that? And how scientists for ages had thought that the universe was eternal. And that in 1915, Einstein came out with this general theory of relativity, and it purported to show even stronger evidence that the universe was eternal. The only thing was he fudged one of his numbers, because he should have discovered what that priest discovered about 12 years later, that the universe is expanding and it had come from just a speck, basically. But why did he fudge his number? It was because he didn't like the philosophical implications that if it has a beginning, then someone began it. So, and then if you remember, scientists after that for 30 years fought the Big Bang Theory. So they, and I think a lot of it has to do with their philosophy. And then last week, we saw on the fossil record, it doesn't support the evolutionary theory, even though scientists say it does. And where it falls very short, as we saw, was the fossil record. Even Darwin said that there should be billions and billions of these intermediate fossils throughout the fossil record. And he assumed that they would be found later because he knew about this problem. They weren't there when the paleontologists of his age actually showed him they weren't there, and he assumed that, well, the geological record is just not that good, and down the road they'll be found. But it's gotten worse for him. They just haven't been found. So here is why, and it kind of goes back to what you said, why scientists, and again, science has done so much, but on some of the things, especially when it overlaps just a little bit with an intelligence or a creator, they just go off, they just become just they throw away their common sense. But here is a quote that I think really synthesizes why scientists miss the boat when there's anything dealing with God. And this is a late Richard Lewontin, well-known Harvard groundbreaking geneticist. And he says, and pay attention because this is such a great quote, he says, "Our willingness," that means scientists' willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense. Now, why would it be against common sense? Is the key to understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises. And why do we do this? Because we have a prior commitment to materialism. Anybody know what materialism is? It's when you want to have really nice clothes and expensive cars. No. Materialism is a philosophy, and it basically says that all that's in the universe is just matter. There's nothing else. There's no soul, there's no spirit, there's no supernatural. It's just what you can feel and touch, basically. And that is what most scientists are. They're materialists. And so he says, because we have a prior commitment to this philosophy of materialism, is why we get things, or we go against common sense. It's not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world. So he's saying, science, all the methods and processes we use, they don't really compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world. But what does? But on the contrary, that we are forced by our prior adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations. No matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. So he's basically here saying that all we can find is materialism because we put our blinders on, and if there's something outside of materialism, like God, like an intelligence, we don't even, we just reject it because it's not in the materialism framework. And he goes on, moreover, that materialism is absolute. It's just an absolute belief. For we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. So I think this is one of the main reasons that scientists keep missing some of these things. So where are we today? It seemed like, starting from Charles Darwin's theory of evolution in 1859, that science and its wonderful discoveries, decade after decade, were making God more and more obsolete. However, in the last 60 years, especially the last 20 to 30 years, that tide has been changing. Today, it seems that many scientific discoveries over the last 60 years have turned the tide, and these discoveries have begun to point more and more to an intelligence behind the universe. This is a book that I get a lot of stuff from, Return of the God Hypothesis, 3 scientific discoveries that revealed the mind behind the universe. The first one was the Big Bang, which we talked about in our first, and we'll get into the other 2 down the road. But, so I think science, and we're going to look at some things, they now can, with these powerful microscopes, look inside a cell, and it's unbelievable what they see in there. You know, when I went to school, back when the earth was cooling, I was taught that it was kind of a blob. I don't know about y'all, but there wasn't much to it. But now it's, and I think that's the reason, I believe there is this return of the God hypothesis is because of these scientific discoveries that keep showing up and up. And in my humble opinion, design is so evident in the universe, in biology, in chemistry, and other scientific fields, scientists have to explain away design. And what do I mean by that? Well, remember Richard Dawkins? Here's a famous quote he made in his 1996, The Blind Watchmaker. It says, biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. So he recognizes that design, you see design, but he says it's just an appearance. It's really, evolution really created this without a purpose. So he discounts you know, intelligence behind what we see today. And this is the famous scientist Francis Crick, who was the co-discoverer of the double helix in the DNA molecule. He said, biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. So as they're doing their science, they're seeing what looks like to be designed, but they got to keep in mind. So what this, I have this picture in my mind of a scientist with a rubber band around his wrist. And every time he's looking at something, he says, goodness, that looks designed. He pulls it, you know, it hurts, and he says, no, this evolved. And so time he gets home at the end of the day, his wrist is all bloody and red. So anyway, that's just my thought on it. Oops. Okay. Has anyone heard of the third way of evolution? Well, I hadn't until recently. Scientists, especially with the ENCO project and other findings in the molecular cell, studies of molecular cells and all of this, these new discoveries have kind of shown that evolution isn't, it's not explaining what we see in real life. And so the third way of evolution is a movement started in 2014 by some of the most well-known scientists in the world in the field of evolutionary theory. Now, I used an AI product called Copilot and asked it this question. It said, it emerged, the third way of evolution emerged as a response to perceived limitations in the traditional neo-Darwin framework. That's just evolution, neo-Darwin. Incorporating new science that we found from molecular biology, epigenetics, and other fields. So, well, I'll just go down and quote. Here's James Shapiro, molecular biology, University of Chicago. For those scientists who take it seriously, Darwinian evolution has functioned more as a philosophical belief system than as a testable scientific hypothesis. And he goes on, he says this quasi-religious function of the theory is, I think, what lies behind many of the extreme statements that you have doubtless encountered from some scientists opposing any critical analysis of neo-Darwinism, again, evolution, in the classroom. So he is basically saying, again, it's getting back to a philosophy, a religion, that are behind all this opposition, or a lot of the opposition that we see to there being an intelligence behind the universe. And then Dennis Noble, he's from the University of Oxford, he's a retired professor there, says, all the central assumptions of the modern synthesis, again, that's evolution, have been disproved. Moreover, they've been disproved in ways that raise the tantalizing prospect of a totally new synthesis, that's theory. So he's saying, we know that evolution isn't true, and now we're looking for a new theory out there. And he also said the fact is, I think neo-Darwinism, again, evolution, is dead. And here's a professor at the University of Vienna. The modern synthesis, again, evolution, leads scientists to look at evolutionary changes as simply the product of natural selection. We talked about natural selection last week a little bit, which doesn't work when trying to explain the origin of the complex features like a new body plan. So, do y'all remember last week when we're talking about the fossil record and the evolutionary tree of life and how it all started down here as a sun plant animal, and then over millions and hundreds of millions of years. It just, everything came from this here. Y'all remember that? But we also looked at what the fossil record actually showed. It doesn't show this. There's no evidence of this. That was just what Darwin thought it was. So what we actually saw were these different, I'm going to call them stalks for lack of a better word, that are totally separate. And this is what we see in the fossil record. There's nothing down here below. These just show up. And if you remember, one of the animals, a lot of those Cambrian animals have gone extinct, but some that are living today are like the jellyfish. Another one that's living today is the horseshoe crab. Another one is clams and sponges. These are, just compare a jellyfish to a horseshoe crab, how different they are. And they just show up, and there's no slow process of getting a jellyfish into a horseshoe crab. So again, as we talked about, this I think are creative events that happened that God did. But so anyway, and I've kind of lost my train of thought, but as we just discussed, these are on separate stalks. They're not originating from this tree of life. They just show up, and they're completely fully formed and ready to go in the fossil record. So basically, my screen done that again. I don't know why that does. Oh, it came back. Oh, thank goodness. Okay, this doesn't really fit in this presentation, but I was looking over some of the notes I've made over the years past, and I just thought it was such a powerful quote and interesting. And this is a quote from a brochure that was at the British Museum of Natural History, a very prestigious institute. And they had an exhibit in 1981, and this is what the brochure said, and I'll just read it. It said on Darwin, it said, evolution by natural selection is not strictly speaking scientific, because it is established by logical deduction rather than empirical demonstration. So what does that mean? Well, Darwin, he couldn't run experiments to prove his theory of evolution. How he came up with his theory of evolution, if you remember those pigeons? And he looked at pigeon breeding and all the different types of pigeons there were. And he, from that and some other research, he said, well, if mankind can breed these animals, and you see all the variety of dogs that we have, then what can nature do over millions and millions of years? But he couldn't prove that by running experiments. That was just a deduction by looking at this. So it's just an interesting thing. You know, evolution is portrayed so much as so strongly scientific, but as we've seen, it's got major, major problems. And back in 1981, they even said it's not really scientific. Okay, what does God say about the evidence He has provided mankind? Y'all remember Romans 1:19 says, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse.
There's, I'm glad that was coming into this, because I was looking at a documentary yesterday. If you go to creation.com/AH, you got a lot of stuff on and stuff. And he says that evolution, if you believe evolution, that exists of what? That exists of creation going through turmoil, strife, dying, coming back, trying to repeated death and suffering, right? On creation is the foundation of evolution. But if you go to the Bible, when does it say that started? Death and all those types of things only started when Adam sinned. Before that, everything was perfect. There wasn't death. There wasn't any of those things until Adam sinned. So that's the starting point of death and suffering, so that alone defeats evolution, right? It happened when Adam sinned, all that death and suffering.
Well, yeah, it did, although I've got a little bit different take on that, but I see what your point is. So.
I think, you know, one problem, Rick and I were talking about this before, one problem with that is that presupposes that the Bible is true.
Right, right.
And if you're having an argument with a scientist, he's not going to agree with that.
Yeah, no.
But I think it's interesting, following on after Romans 19, I don't know if you're going to or not, but into Romans 22, it says, claiming to be wise, they became fools.
Yeah, and we saw that in that quote of that scientist explaining that how materialism, he says, even if it's counterintuitive, even if it doesn't make any sense, we still hold to it because we're committed to our philosophy, our religion of materialism.
Fools.
Yeah, exactly.
Lynn, I have an observation and I have a statement.
Okay.
The observation is, look around this room and see how many boomers are in this room. We're the vast majority in this room. Well, the calling of that is that we look at all this and understand how we can have an impact on our upcoming generations, on our children, on our grandchildren, great-grandchildren. And so as we look around this room, this information we're gathering is a great amount of information that we can share. We grew up when all this was being introduced into the school systems.
Mm-hmm.
We know it's in the school systems.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there's a tremendous amount of curiosity from this age group who's vastly represented here, not everybody. But, so that's my observation. The statement I want to make is, you were talking about the way scientists are in complete denial of coming from a biblical perspective. They have a tremendous amount of time, energy put into what they're doing to destroy anything that may be faith related, that their lives are dedicated to doing that, really. They're not necessarily looking for the truth, even though what they may think is the truth is the outcome. But what I want to do is express to this group that we have to be careful as well as truth is revealed to us, that we not become prideful and look on them the way they have looked on us. That we come to them with compassion, and that we come to them with an ability to share what we've learned and how science has actually proven what our faith has said for thousands of years. I want to read to you Psalm 10, verse 4. It says, "In the pride of his face, the wicked does not seek him," which I see as the science aspect of this. "All his thoughts are, there is no God." And so as we go through this, we have to look for opportunities that we can compassionately share with people the truth that we know, and use it as an opportunity to share the gospel.
Exactly. You know, because if you're out in the public square and you start talking about Christianity, And they may raise a thing, well, the Bible isn't true. That's another thing we're going to get on, is to do this thing on, is the evidence for the reliability of the Bible. But you just can't say the Bible said it, you know, to them, because they don't believe the Bible.
You're out of time.
I'm out of time?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
10:30.
That's my
just saying.
fault.
Okay.
Thank you for giving me a platform.
Okay, well, no, I'm glad you shared that. And thank y'all for coming today, and I appreciate it. And I have put these out on, I created a, what is it, Carol?
YouTube?
YouTube channel.
Oh, wonderful.
I couldn't believe I did it.
Yay, yeah.
You know, I'm not very technical. And I actually figured out how to do it. Carol just almost dropped over when I did it because she couldn't believe I could do it. But anyway, it's really easy. But anyway, if y'all want to just, if you want to watch any of these or have some other people watch it, if you'll just go to youtube.com and in their search bar, just put my name, L-E-N Crawford. It'll pull up. Now it pulls up some other Lynn Crawfords, but you can determine which one. I'm the best looking one out there. Just look for that. Any other questions or comments?
I got one. I wasn't here last week, and I'm sorry, but we were talking about the fossil stuff. And what's important that I have found out is that, first of all, carbon-14 is an element that only has a life expectancy of no more than 100,000 years. And some of these fossils and stuff they're pulling up and digging up and saying, oh, they're 2 billion years old, have carbon-14 footprints, which would indicate right off the bat that that's not true. The fossils that they're finding are not that old. They're less than 100,000 years old. So their whole dating process is askew. But again, they have to force it to align. Anything that shows outside of that is they throw away as non-functional knowledge, and they only adhere to what proves their theory. They trash everything else. But it's important to keep in mind that it's got carbon-14 footprint. It ain't that old.
Okay.
I don't know if people knew that or not, but yeah, it's important to know.
So, sweetie, did you hear that? I'm not that old. Any other questions or comments? Yes.
I have one quick thing. The scientists that are atheists are not researching the spirit of the human body because, for example, last night, Lee Strobel, The Case for Heaven, they don't research people that have had experiences where they claim they've seen Jesus or died and came back to earth. So there's a lot of things out there that they're avoiding as far as humans having a spirit. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Because that proves that there is life after death. They're avoiding that fact. And I don't understand why our country says, "In God we trust," and then they teach Darwinism in school. It makes no sense to me. But anyway, I think they're missing something as far as the human spirit being a part of the human structure, DNA. Does that make any sense?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes.
It makes me think in education, somebody's writing the textbooks, and it seems to me after all this that it's very one-sided and probably written by atheists or non-believers because there's been other discoveries, obviously, since, but you just wonder, is it ever going to include
I don't know.
Ideas,
I would like to think so, but I'm not so sure, because as we saw, this third wave is these scientists who now say, well, now we see all these problems with evolution, but now we've got to come up with a different theory. And even on their website, the third wave, it says there's 2 ways of looking at everything that we see. It says it's through evolution, which we now know is not true, or it's through creationism. And they say, well, we can't get into creationism because it's not scientific.
Yeah.
So so their work, and they don't have any other theories. I mean, they come up with these, but nothing
Yeah.
works. It just doesn't work.
Yeah,
And,
but
you know-
neither does that, so why would that be the way they present it? It just seems outdated.
Well, what I'm sharing is pretty cutting edge, you know. This, you know, if you're in high school or college, you're probably not going to hear this about junk DNA, and that this group of scientists have started this thing that says we don't believe in evolution anymore. You know, it gets hidden, and so, and you know, I don't want to discount science because it's done a lot for us, and there are very strong Christians who are scientists. But you know, science, in my opinion, should be the search for truth. You know, wherever it falls, and I don't.
Usually folks have no opinion up front to find the truth. Right? You have your opinions up front.
Okay.
You find those support.
All right. Well, thank you. Thanks for everybody coming.
Thanks, Lynn.
And again, try to get as many people for Jana's thing on February 16th. It's going to be at 3 in the afternoon. So.
So this is our last.